Milling Through History presents The Queen of Crime. When it comes to Agatha Christie, many people know her as being one of the most prolific mystery authors of the 20th century. However, what many people might not realize is that the journey she took in order to become such a famous author is one that is worthy of her own style of mystery, for there are certain aspects of her life which seem quite peculiar, if not unique. She was born September 15th, 1890, in Torquay, England, and while her mother did not want her to learn how to read until the age of 8, Agatha Christie ended up learning how to read by the age of 4 due to her inquisitive nature. Her education was a home one, and it was found to be under the supervision of both her parents and her sister. By the year 1900, though, Agatha Christie was going to boarding schools in both England and in France. And with the decline of her mother's health, Christie and her mother would travel to Egypt, which would help to become one of the early source materials for her writings. The first time, however, that Agatha Christie would pick up the pen and write a story was in 1908, with a short story referred to as The House of Beauty. Her first novel was also written around this time, called Snow Upon the Desert. In 1912, she would meet Archibald Christie, and the two would be married in the Christmas of 1914. While her husband went off to war, Agatha Christie remained home and would first work as a nurse, then a dispenser, and finally an apothecary's assistant. In 1916, she would write the mysterious Ferret Styles, which would introduce the world to her most famed detective, Hercule Poirot. But the book would not become published until 1920. The reason for her decision to create her primary character as being Belgian was due to the fact that she had encountered so many Belgian refugees coming to England during the First World War. However, while The Mysterious Affair at Styles has become a very famous novel, in 1920 it was extremely difficult to find publishers who would want to print her work. But after the success in 1920, in the 3 years that she was publishing and producing works, she would discover that because of her style of writing and her popularity, it didn't take very long for her to become a very easy person to have work published with. However, as soon as she was starting to reach the height of her fame, on December 3rd, 1926, Agatha Christie would mysteriously disappear. This disappearance would become national headlines, and after 10 days of being missing, Christie reappeared at the Swan Hydropathic Hotel with absolutely no memory of the previous 10 days. Many people believe this may have actually been a bit of a publicity stunt, namely because there had been word that Agatha Christie's husband Archibald had asked for a divorce, and she was suffering from a nervous breakdown. In 1928, both Christie and her husband would divorce, but she was able to keep his last name, as it was the name she was using as an author and people would recognize her by. 2 years later, she would remarry Max Mallowan, and the two would remain married for the rest of her life. In 1934, in her travels throughout the world, she would write The Murder on the Orient Express. With the outbreak of the Second World War, Agatha Christie would return to her work in the pharmacy and update her knowledge on poisons, which she would use in her later writings. Ironically enough, this knowledge of poison was so great that when Scotland Yard was investigating a crime, one of the detectives had read her most recent novel and found that the murderer had used the same technique that Christie had devised. As such, she herself even became a prime suspect, until it became very clear exactly how she knew so much about poisons due to her service during the 2 World Wars. In the 1960s, she was appointed the Commander of the Order of the British Empire, awarded an honorary doctorate of literature by the University of Exeter, and was styled Lady Mallowan after her husband was knighted. In 1971, she was promoted to Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire. Her last novel, Postern of Fate was released in 1973. However, while this was her last new novel, she had written 2 other books, those books being the final mysteries of her 2 most famous detectives, Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple. On January 12, 1976, Agatha Christie would pass away. However, prior to her death, Christie's last 2 books had been published, namely due to the success of the film version of Murder on the Orient Express. In perhaps one of the greatest tributes to an author, on August 6, 1975, just a brief 5 months before her own death, Agatha Christie would witness the fact that the New York Times would give an obituary to Hercule Poirot, the only literary character to ever receive a front-page obituary on a major newspaper. For more information, please consider these suggested titles. Be sure to click on the left-hand side of the screen to subscribe to our show, and on the right-hand side for our latest episode. And we will see you again for the next episode of Milling Through History.